So when I was doing this, I actually did the majority of it in the iPad Pro using the pencil. And the initial setup I did in Photoshop, it was pretty simple. Very just a paper overlay over uh, blue for the water and I had no color over the lands. And the white was the snow, so I just kind of paper overlaid it and then on that layer. And then it was just a matter of going through and kind of developing my concept as I started building this. And so the hardest part about it was what to do to fill the land up. As I worked on this, I had my major points. I had my city, I had my farms, I had my cemetery, and I started working on the concept a little bit more and a little bit more, and I started getting these holes in there. I had kind of the gypsy forest going on. I had the lake going on and the rivers and all of that stuff, and that filled some of it up. But as you can tell, there's a lot of empty spots in there. So the hardest thing for me to work with was actually like what to put in the map. As I worked on the map, it was a challenge just picking landmarks out and things like that. So I did a lot of research on the old maps, and honestly, the old maps weren't a lot of help. It was more the fantasy stuff that helped me out a little bit more. So I started thinking about how I would do my local city, Green Bay. I figured out how I would do that, and I started putting those icons in there. So I started adding in, like statues and other items that were of notice from a landmark situation in this map itself, and it started filling up slowly but surely. And I realized as I did this, there were a lot of other ways to kind of work on this map, as far as like putting elements and things like that in there. And I also realized I didn't have to fill up said map. So as you can see, I just filled up like a lot of little forests and little trees, and the map started flushing out a little bit more. And it's actually not that hard because it's a series of just really simple drawings. A little box and a triangle for the roof, and you put a couple of them together. You create a house, and then I put a point on the top and created a church, and I added many together, and I created a house, or a village. I added a little waterfall, all of things like that I thought about the nature's development, and looking at different aspects of what I was working on. And now, because you see up in the corner, I have a water, and you can't really read it, but I also have a line work. So I didn't use straight black. That was kind of one of the things that I really noticed. If you don't use straight black, it looks a lot more authentic than anything else. And like I said, I did the majority of this in the iPad Pro, and it wasn't until I jumped over to Photoshop to start kind of coloring things and adding text. That was the majority of what I was working with. So it was all the little pieces like that kind of helped me out. And so, when I felt the land was filled up, and I thought this was a good idea for me to do, because of the simple fact that I can add more to it. I can, this is kind of going to be my in progress thing. And here's where I jump over to Photoshop. And so a lot of what I did in Photoshop was actually really simple. It was more text manipulation than anything else. What I did was I had my line work on a separate layer, and all my lines and all that information. And all I did was essentially type out. I found a script style font, and I typed things out. And from there, I essentially just masked out the line work that I did, so I didn't really destroy anything. And that was kind of the best way to do things, I felt. And pretty much that was the methodology I used. I mean, you can see the little details and little bits and pieces like that. And it was actually really a simple project. It was just a more or less a matter of what I was doing with things, uh, and that's it. That was the thought process was very simple. It was type, and it was clean up and things like that in Photoshop that I worked on. And so as I worked on this a little bit more, it was just little bits and pieces. I did a lot of pretty simple typing, pretty standardized stuff. So here was what I do is I create a new layer and I essentially just pick a slight green color and I kind of color match it. And I use kind of a water style brush. It's, I think, just a round, soft round or something like that. And I simply just start adding a little texture, kind of like I'm hand painting the forest and things like that. I did it really rough, and it actually was quite fast to do. And the reason I did it in Photoshop was just because at this point in time I didn't feel like I needed to jump back and forth. And so I painted in the grass, the trees, anything that really kind of stood out as a forest, and I color manipulated it so that it would change the initial kind of concept. And I colored in the major structures like the land and things like that, and added a little bit of brown to other areas. And so that gave me a quick concept of what I wanted to do for kind of the whole island and the whole terrain as a whole. And it kind of looks a little bit splotchy, but it was pretty simple, very even, very laid back. And I'll probably go in and tweak it so the colors aren't as strong, maybe a little bit more faded. And other than that, it's pretty simple to do. It wasn't tough at all. And the final piece was essentially I just took a splatter brush and added a new layer with a little bit of red on there, and I multiplied that layer, and then lowered the opacity so that it, kind of had that blood feel, like something bad happened to the last owner. And so I just probably need to do a little bit of color correcting, and I'm essentially done.